Idealism's one that's thrown out there so often because Van Til will use terms like concrete, universal, and other phrases that were typically used by idealists, either absolute idealists or of the British variety. But there are also Americans. There's also Germans. We've got Hegel. We've got Kant. You name it. Van Til was thoroughly aware of various forms of idealism and sought to criticize them and really to destroy that theology as it posed a danger to the church, even in his doctoral dissertation. And he never stopped doing it throughout all of his works. Nevertheless, at least as early as the 1950s, in 1953, with the Calvin Forum, there were several articles by Jesse DeBoer, Cliff Orlebeck, and others who were claiming that Van Til was an idealist. Look at the terms he uses. He's an idealist. And now we're seeing a resurrection of this with the criticisms from Fesco and others who are presently resurrecting a criticism from 70 years ago. So how did Van Til relate to idealism? What was his intent? And not just his intent, but what do his writings demonstrate about his awareness of idealism and his fundamental critique of it?
That's something we deal with in the course, both in the intro and the first lecture and then in the final lecture. And let me just put it this way. The hallmark of idealism, the absolute idealism that Van Til was interacting with, is that the absolute needs the particulars of the changing space-time world to achieve full self-consciousness, to come to full actualization. Put it this way, Barth actualizes the mutuality of God and man at the alpha point in the Christ event. That's where God and time, God and man come together in this third time, and both are mutually becoming in the Christ event. For the absolute idealist, there is an incremental movement by which the absolute comes toward full self-actualization, comes toward full self-consciousness of both self and the world through a process of interaction with space-time particularity, moving toward what Hegel called a concrete universal, where there's nothing in the universal not expressed in the particulars, there's nothing in the particulars not contained in the universal. And the point of absolute idealism is that the absolute becomes absolute only at the omega point of an historical process. Van Til paced Barth and paced the idealists, but now we're talking about idealism. Van Til says, no. If you're looking for a concrete universal, a fully self-conscious, self-contained, self-complete entity, do not think of an historical process moving toward an omega point and yielding a concrete universal. Rather, think of God himself as self-contained, self-complete, immutable, impassible, and simple in all of his relation to creation, from its alpha to its omega. That God remains self-contained at every point along the line. There is no becoming, there is no development, there is no unactualized potential in God. And so Van Til's critique of absolute idealism, we could talk about Kant if we decide to, is that it reduces to pragmatism, to the idea that space and time and change and chance are fundamental to the identity of the developing absolute. And so Van Til's brilliant critique of idealism, and by the way, if you don't understand his doctoral dissertation and his critique of idealism, you're going to miss the rest of his theology and his critique of post-Enlightenment theology and philosophy in particular. His critique is that absolute idealism is no better than pragmatism. Why? Because it cannot affirm at any point the self-contained, self-complete triune personal God. And so in this lecture series, we try to feature that and say that when Van Til uses the language of the concrete universal, it's analogous to John using the Logos theology, using the Logos language in John 1, and saying the Logos is not an immanent principle of rationality, but the self-contained person of the Trinity that second person of the Trinity, eternally begotten of the Father, and as such, immutable, impassible, and self-contained. So Van Til's language of concrete universal, far from being a concession to idealism, is the strongest conceivable critique of idealism, because he's saying that what the idealists are after, a concrete universal, cannot be found through a historical process
Oh
that
yeah.
yields a concrete universal. You have to begin with the one and in whom unity and diversity are equally ultimate and equally immutable from all eternity.